Hi, my name is Mike Treder. I'm the Managing Director at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, a nonprofit techno-progressive think tank. I've spent most of the last 10 years thinking about, writing about, and talking about the implications of powerful new technologies, whether it's military or environmental or social aspects of those technologies. And I've also known Jamais Cascio for about those 10 years, and I consider him one of the deepest thinkers on these subjects. So I'm very pleased today to have this opportunity to do a Blogging Heads interview with Jamais Cascio. Jamais, welcome to Blogging Heads TV.
Thank you very much. I'm Jamais Cascio. I've been working in the field of futures thinking, futurism, foresight, blah, 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 for about 15 years. I worked with Global Business Network back in the 1990s, and these days I'm a research fellow with the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. I'm also the co-founder of a site called worldchanging.com back in 2003, and I was the lead writer there for a few years. And these days I blog at openthefuture.com, but I also write for Fast Company, and I have pieces in The Atlantic and all over the place. I usually describe myself as an easily distracted generalist, and I think that pretty much sums me up.
And I think we should mention that we have a close connection, that is that you are also a senior fellow with the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which is where I am located. And we, as I say, we've known each other a long time and have talked about these issues many times over the years. So hopefully it'll be an interesting conversation for people to hear. And I want to start out by bringing up something that I think you're probably best known for at this point, which is the cheeseburger footprint. Can you tell us what that's all about?
Yeah. A few years back, I got to thinking about issues around climate and carbon credits and carbon footprints and the like. And over the course of one piece I was writing, I was wondering, well, we tend to think about carbon in terms of big industrial sources, factories and transportation networks and the like. And well, what is, I wondered, something more prosaic? What about something like a cheeseburger? Okay, thinking, well, maybe you go to McDonald's or Burger King or whatever and pay an extra N cents for carbon offsets. Well, okay, how many cents would that be? So I got to looking around, actually found some good information to start putting the pieces together about energy consumption and methane outgassing and all sorts of wonderful things like that. And it turns out that each burger has, when you combine things like the energy used for production, transportation, the methane that comes from cattle, which turns out to be a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. And you can put it all together and you get for one burger, you get a carbon footprint of about 4.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. 4.5 kilograms. What does that mean? In and of itself, that number is pretty meaningless. However, if you look at how many burgers we eat over the course of a year, in the United States, the numbers range for between 50 and 150 per person on average. Wow. So that's average out over 300 million people. And what you end up with is an overall carbon footprint of about 15 to 20 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent just from burgers. And that is actually bigger than the footprint. I'm sorry?
Burgers consumed in the United States.
Burgers consumed in the United States, right.
Right.
And that's actually about as big as the footprint for all of the sport utility vehicles on the road. Now, that's tailpipe emissions for the trucks versus life cycle emissions for the burgers. So it's not exactly an exact comparison, but it's illustrative. And the point of all this wasn't to say, oh, my God, you got to stop eating cheeseburgers, whatever you do. The point of it was to say everything we do has an impact, even the most prosaic. And the only way we can make good choices about what we want to do about global warming and the like is to have a better sense, a better understanding of what our more prosaic, everyday impacts really are.
Now, I live in New York, and here restaurants have been required for the last year or two to include on their menu both calorie counts and now counts of trans fats that whatever food you're ordering or choosing might include. What do you think about or do you think it will ever become an issue for the governments might start requiring restaurants or even grocery stores to include the carbon footprint, so to speak, of the food items that they're selling?
It's entirely possible. I mean, I put together when I wrote this thing a few years ago, I actually ended up putting together a basic graphic for a carbon facts label that looked very much like the nutrition facts that you get on a box of cereal or something. And the idea wasn't that this is what it should look like so much as you might start seeing these kinds of labels. And in fact, in the UK and a few other places, you are starting to see these kinds of labels on products representing their carbon footprints. There's one big important difference between something like measuring calorie counts or trans fats and looking at carbon footprints, and that's how easily you can calculate the number. With trans fat or with calorie count, you can use a pretty simple chemical process to get the exact amount for that unit of food. With carbon footprints, there's a lot of estimates and hand waving that goes into it. I mean, do you use, how far is a given amount of food product shipped? So what's the carbon footprint of the transportation? What are the cattle fed? Because grass-fed cattle have a different kind of emission patterns than grain-fed cattle. So it ends up being really difficult to get a good number. In fact, the number that I came up with, that 4.5 kilograms, for a long time I said, well, I know it's probably right within an order of magnitude, but I wasn't willing to go any further than that. I did see some independent Japanese research a couple years ago that actually came up with something like 4 kilograms. So I knew I was pretty much right with my number. But still, very hand-wavy, very much around in the world of estimates. And so it could very well be that the burger you get from a McDonald's in Manhattan has a much higher footprint than the burger you get from McDonald's in Chicago, simply because of the transportation costs.
So I wonder here, are you suggesting, or should someone who's watching this take the message from that it's the beef that is the culprit, or the cheese or the bun, or is it more that we should be eating local foods? For example, if I ate a locally processed cheeseburger versus a cheeseburger that is fast food, and the meat might have actually come, some of it, from South America or some places. What messages should I take from that?
The message is that everything matters. That's the message I'm going for. However, in this particular case, the question you're asking, generally speaking, when it comes to beef, beef is far and away the worst kind of food in terms of carbon impact, because of the amount of space it takes for cattle ranches and the all the things, sort of ancillary aspects of beef production, but primarily because cattle in particular have a very high methane count for their what the EPA very politely calls enteric fermentation, and the rest of us call cattle farts and burps. And so cattle are particularly bad in that regard. So the transportation aspect of a cheeseburger is a much smaller proportion of the overall footprint than the beef part of it.
Okay.
That balance is going to be different for something like a chicken or fish, and in those cases, it's probably better to eat local chicken than to have it transported from all over the place. The whole thing about local foods, though, is really kind of difficult because, one, not all the transportation networks are identical. Not all the local production methods are identical. So there are plenty of cases where stuff brought in overseas actually has a lower overall footprint than stuff made locally, just because of the different methods used. But more importantly, there are all the other things beyond carbon that you have to consider. So, for example, there was a lot of talk in the UK about putting carbon footprint information on foods, and the protest came from, of all places, Africa. Because it turns out that when people start to see the distance traveled information that often gets rolled into this kind of stuff, and they try to buy locally, what that's doing is actually undermining the export economies of developing countries, which is not a good thing. And so you end up with a really tough decision. Do you buy on the basis of carbon, or do you buy on the basis of global ethics, or what? And so a lot of us just sort of throw up our hands.
Well, and unfortunately, it seems like we're coming to another area where there are no simple answers.
Right, right. Well, they're rarely simple answers.
Yes.
Simple
Yeah,
answers are
and
almost always wrong, unfortunately.
right. Yeah. They're satisfying or comforting in the short term, but don't really do anything for us in the long term.
Exactly, exactly.
Now, we probably should try to put this in a little bit of context, make it clear that the purpose of your original plan to develop the cheeseburger footprint, the reason that you came up with the idea in the first place, had to do with global warming.
Oh yeah, of course.
So, can you, in a 30 seconds or so, give me a sense of what your overall attitude is about global warming?
Global warming is probably the biggest problem we're facing this century. And
Wow.
that's my one-sentence summary. And that's because it's a global problem where every actor contributes and no one actor can act sufficiently to stop global warming's continuation. So you have to have global cooperation. We've never been very good at that. Moreover, and probably more critically, it's what I call a long lag problem. So the kinds of the issues that we're facing with it is that the greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere today actually don't have an impact on us for another couple of decades because the atmospheric cycles and ocean cycles and the like.
Right.
Meaning that what we're experiencing right now in terms of the 1 degree or so warming that we've seen is actually the result of carbon put into the atmosphere decades ago. And if we were to stop putting all carbon into the atmosphere right this very second, total cessation right now, we would still see another few decades, possibly another half century of warming. And that's because of what's called thermal inertia in the oceans and what people are calling carbon commitment, blah, blah, blah. But what it comes down to is that this is a complex system that doesn't turn on and off like a spigot. So if we want to avoid disaster a half century hence, we have to actually act now and not just wait until the disaster is imminent. And people aren't very good at that. And
That
so
raises
what we have is a really complex problem that's complex because it can't be solved easily, and it can't be solved by one actor. It requires coordination, and it requires long-term thinking. And looking just at history, global coordination and long-term thinking aren't really our strong suits.
Right. What you just said raises a couple of pretty significant questions for me. One is about you said that you consider global warming briefly and simply the most important or biggest problem we're going to face in this century.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on what the components are of that problem, where it could do the most damage. But and maybe before we go to that, let me ask you, you said that one of the reasons it is such a big problem is because we're not very good at solving problems that require cooperation on a global scale and that require both local action and large-scale action.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of getting back to the cheeseburger footprint where we began with this, is it enough first of all, is it enough for individuals to make changes to use, let's say, compact fluorescent light bulbs instead of incandescent bulbs, to use public transportation instead of driving cars, to recycle as much as they can, and to stop eating cheeseburgers? Is that really enough to make a significant difference? Should people feel like if they're not changing their personal lifestyles, they are significantly to blame for global warming? Or, on the other hand, is it possible that even if everybody did those, nature-friendly things, that the problem would still be quite acute because of the trucks and airplanes and factories, coal power plants that are pouring greenhouse gases into the air? How do you respond to somebody who might have a concern like that?
It's necessary but not sufficient. So if you were to do all those things and live a completely hair shirt green lifestyle, where you deprive yourself of everything fun simply to avoid having a carbon footprint, that's individually not going to make a big difference to the planet. Conversely, every person that doesn't try to do something to help makes it that much harder for the solution to come about. And the thing is, and the unfortunate and scary thing is, that same kind of argument could apply to transportation, could apply to energy production. Shifting from coal-fired power plants to solar and wind and hugs is necessary, absolutely necessary, but absolutely not sufficient. It is absolutely not going to do enough to, in and of itself, simply doing that is not going to do enough to alleviate carbon emissions. So you have to do that plus changing transportation methodologies, plus changing the kinds of things that we eat. And that just adds more and more layers of complexity.
Right, and requires more and more levels of cooperation.
Exactly.
Whether it's communities, national governments, or international cooperation, which is probably the most difficult to achieve.
Right. And so what you end up with is a challenge. And the reason I describe it as the biggest problem we're going to face this century is, in some ways, a little bit of a trick. Because there actually are very likely to be even bigger, more potentially catastrophic things that we face in terms of emerging technologies, in terms of an asteroid impact or something like that. But if we can't get our act together to deal with this, we're probably not going to make it through this century regardless. However, if we figure out the kinds of ways, the tools and mechanisms for coordination, for foresight, for what I've been tending to call civilizational resilience, that would be enough to grapple with and respond to global warming, we're very likely to be able to deal with these other kinds of issues that are almost certain to occur over the course of the century. So basically, if we don't deal with global warming, that's it. If we do deal with global warming, we're actually in a much better position to deal with everything else.
So it's a learning curve that can be applied to other existential crises that we may be facing.
Exactly.
Okay, great. But I'm sure that some of the people who are watching this might wonder about a statement you made that if we don't deal with global warming appropriately in the near term, we might not even make it through this century. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I don't mean total human extinction. What I mean is that it ends up being so damaging to our global civilization that it will take probably another couple centuries to recover. And that would come from rising sea levels. Certainly that hurts, considering that over half the human population lives within 100 miles of a coastline. But it's also issues around soil degradation. It turns out that when you have rising carbon levels, atmospheric carbon levels that can damage soil, ocean acidification. You basically are wiping out life in the oceans if you have too high of a level of atmospheric carbon, because it gets absorbed by the oceans and acidifies. Issues around drought and changing pestilence patterns. It turns out, for example, that various kinds of bugs and microbes and all sorts of what we tend to think of as pests tend to respond better, tend to survive better in chaotic environmental conditions than do things that we like. And so what we're seeing already is that things like tree pests, I'm blanking on the term that I want. Basically, the kinds of bugs that attack trees are moving faster into new tree zones as temperature changes than we're able to deal with. And so
I think you're thinking of the pine bark beetles,
exactly,
especially in the American West. Yeah.
Exactly. And so what we end up with is a situation where no one thing kills us, but we have such a panoply of disasters facing us, mutually reinforcing disasters, that it ends up bankrupting us at best, and probably causing us pretty significant dieback of the human population.
Wow. What do you think of people who say that global warming might actually turn out to be a benefit to humanity because it will open up vast new areas for agricultural development, say in Siberia or in Canada?
They're either evil or stupid.
Wow.
I mean, to be blunt.
Go ahead, be blunt.
There are so many things that we know are correlates to rapid changes of planetary temperature. There are so many things that we know simply through physics and chemistry happen when you have that kind of rapid increase in carbon in the atmosphere and in the oceans. That to deny that this would be a planetary scale disaster means that you're either willfully ignoring the scientific data, or you simply don't care that literally hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people, will die. Right. And so you're either stupid or evil.
Okay, I'll go along with that. I can't argue. So I think you've laid out the scope of the problem. We could go into detail on any of them if we wanted, whether it's ocean acidification or droughts and crop failures, whether it's pestilence and disease spreading. Mm-hmm. One thing you didn't mention, I think, is the potential for pandemics. When
pandemic disease and just thinking in terms of four horsemen, there's also war. I mean, there was a report that came out just a few months ago estimating that we're likely to see probably in excess of 30 million more casualties to warfare in Africa, driven by rapid environmental changes, basically driven by global warming. Yeah, it's not that killed by global warming directly, but killed by the conflict that arises when you have aggressive competition for dwindling resources.
Right, water supplies in particular.
Water supplies, land supplies, and the like.
Yeah. Now, all right, so let's talk, I think we've laid out the problem pretty clearly, and we can kind of stipulate that global warming is occurring, that the effects are occurring faster than have been anticipated, that it is largely man-made. Mm-hmm. So let's start talking then about what some solutions might be. You mentioned the word resilience, and I kind of want to get to your ideas on civilizational resilience. But sticking with the climate change issue for a little while, you're also pretty well known as someone who has studied what is called geoengineering.
Right.
And I guess first let's start by defining, how do you define geoengineering?
Geoengineering is sort of the umbrella term for a range of large-scale technical and engineering processes designed to alter pretty significant planetary scale aspects of geophysical systems. So changing how much sunlight hits the surface, changing directly how much carbon is in the ocean by through a variety of different mechanisms. These are pretty big, necessarily planet-wide responses. For the most part, they are intended not to solve global warming in terms of removing the direct causation. They're intended to alleviate or at least suppress symptoms. The people who are working on geoengineering ideas, probably 90% of them do so with the intent not to say that's it. We can beat global warming by simply using more technology. What they're saying is that we can beat global warming by reducing our carbon impacts. However, by using geoengineering, we can delay the onset of some of the worst effects of global warming, giving us time to change our carbon output levels.
But that is all assumed that these various geoengineering methods are applied wisely, with sufficient foresight, with adequate testing, mm-hmm. And so forth. And one of my concerns is that they won't be. These methods might be developed and implemented without sort of due process, without careful consideration of potential side effects, or without even having the knowledge of what will happen with a climate, a complex, chaotic system like the environment. So
geoengineering is a tool of desperation, and my guess is we're likely to see some experiments with, and at least tentative deployments of geoengineering sometime in the next decade or two. That's because with most of the geoengineering processes under discussion, the impact in terms of temperatures will be felt fairly quickly. More importantly, they can be undertaken by a single actor, that is, a single country, a single mm-hmm. large corporation, or even potentially a rich individual could underwrite a geoengineering experiment without requiring the cooperation of other countries. even though the geoengineering process will inevitably affect other countries. And so what we have right there is a real potential for a political explosion. And so I wrote a book on geoengineering, Hacking the Earth. And the focus of it wasn't on what are the details, the different kinds of methodologies. Talk a little bit about that. But really was about what are the moral and political questions that surround this idea of going in and making intentional changes to geophysical systems to save our own lives.
Yeah, it sounds to me like there's a great potential for conflict there. If, as you say, either one nation should decide unilaterally to impose some sort of solution that ends up having an impact, potentially, possibly a negative impact on other countries in terms of manipulating with the climate, but also individuals, some .com billionaire who decides he's got the idea that is going to save the planet, and so he starts mounting some sort of program to blast sulfates into the air, whatever it might be.
Right. That's actually Nathan Myhrvold from Microsoft. If you look at intellectualventures.com, he actually has an elaborate plan that his group is working on to do just that.
Right.
I mean, this isn't science fiction or a spy movie.
Right.
This is something that's happening right now.
And if one country decides it doesn't like what another country can do or can't accept, can't possibly go along with what another country might be doing, or one individual should decide he doesn't like what another individual is doing, or any of those complex relationships, it seems to me that there's a greater potential for conflict, for war, even if these solutions are not implemented as on the basis of very large consensus international agreements.
Right, and that's a very real problem because you think in terms of countries in particular acting in reaction to threats to their existence. Well, a couple of the models about geoengineering have shown that there's a pretty high likelihood that some efforts with the sulfate injection, pumping stuff into the stratosphere to block out a small percentage of sunlight, will have the unintended consequence of changing global rainfall patterns, in particular reducing the monsoonal rains in South Asia. Now, when we think of monsoons in South Asia, we typically have this image of people being flooded out in Bangladesh, but the reality is that monsoonal rains are absolutely critical to the agricultural life in agricultural systems in South Asia and India, and to water supplies. And alterations to the monsoonal rain pattern, reductions of monsoonal rains, has a very real likelihood of triggering famines.
Right.
And so India would have a very good case for saying, you do this, you're threatening our existence. This is an act of war. Conversely, a country, a very low-lying country, may say, people trying to block geoengineering and therefore allowing temperatures to increase and glaciers to melt and sea levels to rise. By blocking geoengineering, you are threatening our very existence. This is an act of war. This is not an easy situation. And the thing that's going to be really tempting is that geoengineering as a process has the potential to be relatively easy to do.
You mean relatively inexpensive for somebody to actually mount?
It's within our technological capabilities right now. It doesn't require some invention of elaborate new tools or technologies.
Right. You've used the term, not in this conversation, but in other things that I've seen you write, you've used the term climate chaos. Let me just first ask you to specify what you mean when you say climate chaos.
Climate chaos or climate disruption are terms I tend to use in my writing preferentially to global warming, because the reality is that global warming, in terms of changing the overall temperature of the global climate system, is accurate in terms of talking about the mechanism, but not necessarily accurate in terms of the results. Because of the nature of how the atmosphere works, how the climate works, among the effects of global warming are likely to be more intense storms in the winter, massive changes to rainfall patterns, basically pretty significant and serious changes to our local climates, our regional climates, But the whole concept of climate change as a meme, as a term, tends to, it was initially even constructed as a way to minimize the perceived impact. And so climate chaos is a much more accurate, in my view, a much more accurate description of what we're likely to deal with than simply climate change.
When I hear the term climate chaos, one of the things, two things it means to me. One is more extremes of weather, more powerful storms, longer droughts, bigger floods,
all very likely,
etc. Greater temperature swings, so more extremes in terms of climate and weather, but also more unpredictability or less predictability. That is, we've been blessed for these last 10,000 years with what's called the Holocene epoch, where global climate has been remarkably stable. And that's why civilization has been able to develop so rapidly and powerfully.
Right.
But we may be bringing that Holocene epoch to an end and putting ourselves into a case where we don't have that relatively mild and predictable climate, where things could start to swing quite rapidly, whether it's to hotter temperatures, droughts, or whether it's to colder temperatures.
Right.
Both things will be more extreme and less predictable.
And that's the one aspect of that a lot of people are not really eager to confront is the feedback effect. That it's not simply a case of either the climate changes due to natural processes or the climate change is due to what humans do. It's a case of there are these ongoing natural processes that, when humans start to make changes, tend to have, to do mutual reinforcement and feedback effects, and what you end up with is a situation where it's very easy to tip the system out of control. It's very easy to tip the system. One example that I think is illustrative is there's a lot of concern, and it's sort of go back and forth. The science goes back and forth, but a lot of concern that rapid melting of glaciers in Greenland could dump a lot of fresh water into the northern Atlantic, disrupting the thermohaline cycle, basically disrupting the warm water that flows from the Gulf Stream up into above Europe and keeps Europe warm. Because otherwise, Paris is the same latitude as someplace in Alaska.
Right.
And so there is a potential, and it's still, like I said, there's a lot of debate about it, but there's a potential that global warming could actually result in a deep freeze in Europe, and possibly globally. And that's because of this complex interaction between human activity and natural cycles.
Well, and I'm wondering if the implementation of geoengineering measures, especially if it's done rashly, or in an uncoordinated fashion with various small countries or even large countries or individuals implementing their own geoengineering methods without coordinating them, if that could actually exacerbate what we call climate chaos.
Oh, certainly. It definitely has the potential to do so. And so the takeaway from this is that if we let things get too far out of control, if we let global warming get too bad, you're inevitably going to see organizations and countries desperate to do something to avoid disaster. And so the longer we delay, the longer we wait, the longer we dither about taking steps to reduce carbon emissions, the more likely it is that we're going to end up undertaking these really risky, really potentially chaos-inducing steps simply out of desperation.
So we only have... can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left in this interview, and I kind of wanted to give you a chance to throw out there in a nutshell what you see as the other serious challenges to civilization during this century. Beyond global warming, what are the other things that we might have to confront?
There are a couple of natural issues. Asteroids are something that are always out there, always lurking around the corner, waiting to pounce. And so we desperately need to have a better system to spot near-Earth objects and potential Earth-impacting objects. There have been enough cases of asteroid impacts unleashing mass devastation on this planet over its geological history. I don't think we want to see that happen during our lifetimes. And so that's one thing. And it's actually fairly simple. And again, these mechanisms that would allow better global coordination around one thing tend to help us have better global coordination around others. In terms of human-triggered activities, there's definitely potential for real disruption arising from the introduction of truly catalytic technologies like molecular nanotechnology, autonomous machine intelligence. I don't care whether you want to think of it as sapient and self-aware or not. It's sort of secondary. It's just the existence of autonomous machine intelligence can be really disruptive. Really advanced bioengineering. And the disruption is, at one level, it's the Bill Joy, the future doesn't need us, it's all these new technologies are going to kill us kind of thing. Yeah, it's a possibility. I'm not going to rule that out. But much more disruptive, and I think much more likely, is the changes that these kinds of technologies make to how we operate our civilization. Changes to how we operate our economy, who has work, who has access, who has political access, right. Changes to how we operate our relationships with each other, our communities. So among the issues around biotechnology are things around neurobiotechnology, understanding how our brain works, which is already being leapt on by advertisers and political pundits as a way of altering how people behave in terms of consumption and voting. And so you can see, sort of go down the list of these kinds of interesting new technologies that have the potential to be really powerful and, possibly really beneficial, that also have to a frightening degree, a real capacity to localize power, a great deal of power, into the hands of a very small number of individuals. And there's plenty of historical precedent for arguing that a great deal of power centralized in the hands of individuals rarely turns out very well. And when you have the kinds of power we're talking about with molecular nanotechnology to essentially construct anything you want, more or less, with autonomous machine intelligence to have a pattern recognition and analysis system that is far faster than a human brain, with biotechnology, especially neurobiotechnologies, to change how our brain works quite literally. There's a very real potential over the course, and these are all probably emerging over the course of 20 to 30 to 40 years. There's a very real potential for these technologies to be so damaging to our civilization that it very quickly devolves into conflict and war.
So with sort of a broad overview of the very serious issues of global warming and climate chaos that we've talked about so far, and with the few other things you've introduced, and I wish we had time to talk about all of them, whether it's advanced nanotechnology or machine intelligence. We didn't talk about robotics, specifically, but how robotics and automation could make human labor more and more obsolete. Mm-hmm. And as you said, neurobiotechnology, et cetera. With all of these challenges that civilization faces, and we didn't even mention the conflicts between those who would go back to a more sort of fundamentalist lifestyle and would prefer to have civilization more managed. I'm thinking of religious fundamentalists. Mm-hmm. The conflict between that and the sort of liberal Enlightenment view that is dominant in the West. Mm-hmm. All of those things coming together in the next few decades seem to bring us to a really dangerous point, and potentially could challenge the survival of civilization as a whole. So, can you give us sort of a in broad terms, what are the key components that you see in a civilizational resilience? A way for us, what are the things that need to be done in order to survive through this century?
Resilience very quickly is the capacity of a system to withstand unexpected shocks, to rebuild itself when necessary, and to thrive when possible. The characteristics of resilient systems include transparency, so you can understand what's happening to be able to make changes if you see problems arising. The whole open source many eyes make all bugs shallow concept. Flexibility, the capacity to alter what you're doing, to alter the configuration of the system fairly readily. Graceful failure, that is, recognizing that everything does fail. Things fail. Mm-hmm. You want to be able to build the system. You want to construct your systems in a way that when they fail, because they will, they fail in a way that doesn't make things worse. So if you have electronic locks on your doors, you don't want to have, if the power goes out, the doors shut entirely and you can't open the door at all, or conversely, the locks are open and anyone can get in or out. It's a very simple example. Collaboration, but actually one of the things a lot of people don't recognize is really important for resilience is redundancy, slack. So it's not that resilient systems aren't necessarily the most efficient and the most profitable, and that's actually probably a good thing, because efficiency is great when everything is working perfectly. Mm-hmm. But ultra-efficient systems, when they fail, they tend to fail catastrophically. Right. So if you have a just-in-time production method, when one element in your just-in-time chain fails, the whole system comes down because you don't have any slack, any redundancy, any buildup of inventory. The internet, for example, conversely, was historically designed to have a lot of redundancy, a lot of built-in slack, so that if one part of a network goes down, there are other myriad other parts of the network that can pick up the network packets and the like. And so that combination of redundancy and transparency and flexibility, all with an element of foresight, because foresight is actually a methodology of being able to understand your options, not to predict the future, but to be able to understand implications. Resilient systems tend to excel in many or all of these. And there aren't very many resilient systems out there, especially in civilizational systems, but they can exist. And so resilience is one, that umbrella concept is one aspect of why I think there is potential for getting through this century and getting through quite nicely, is that we do have these elements that, if we can get them together, could actually give us the kind of system structure to be able to respond to these kinds of issues.
So to wrap things up then, we've talked a lot about problems today and a little bit about solutions. Would you consider yourself, at this point, with all you know and all you've studied and all you've written and talked about, in terms of the long-term survival and thriving of humanity, would you consider yourself an optimist or a pessimist?
I think ultimately I'm an optimist, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, because I do see, in all of the writing and the work that I've done, there are so many different tools that we have available to us to wrestle with, to deal with these kinds of issues, that it's difficult for me to see scenarios in which we simply ignore all of these tools. So there's a level of optimism that comes from simply that level of recognition. Optimism also comes from something that there was a Norwegian sociologist named Evelyn Lindner, and something that she said that really has resonated with me. And she said that pessimism is a luxury of good times. In difficult times, pessimism is a self-inflicted, self-fulfilling death sentence. Right. And so we simply can't afford to be pessimists. If we are pessimists, we have given up, and I don't see wanting to give up.
Well, I hope you're right about that.
I hope so too.
All right, Jamais, it's been a great pleasure as always talking with you, and look forward to seeing you next time we're at a conference or someplace together.
Look forward to it too. Good to talk with you, Mike.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.